Welcome to my first episode. My name is Emma Hayes, and I am currently a senior at the University of Rhode Island. The podcast you are listening to is for an honors project here at URI so I can complete the honors program. Sex, Suffrage, and Scandalous Ladies is a passion project that I hope will blend both of my majors of communication studies and gender and women's studies. The first episode you are listening to will cover some of the basics of the suffrage movement and some of the monumental women that helped form the movement and ultimately ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Although the movement made strides for women, it wasn't without flaws. Some of the themes explored in this episode include how Alice Paul and the National Women's Party spread their message and how their tactics influence future movements. It is also important to talk about the intersectionality of the movement and the diversity, or lack thereof, as we'll come to learn in the movement. To start with Alice Paul and the National Women's Party engaged in tactics that not only captured attention, but forced people to listen. The women of this organization were nothing short of committed. They sacrificed their time, energy, and in extreme cases, their health to earn the right to vote. The militant actions and powerful statements of the National Women's Party proved to be effective and instrumental in the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Alice Paul herself was born in 1885 in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. She was the oldest of 4 children, and her parents were Quakers who believed in social issues and the advancement of many people. It is her mother It is said her mother was a suffrage and used to take Alice with her to meetings as a child. When Paul was a young woman after college, she spent time in England and was an assistant to Emmeline Pankhurst in 1908. Pankhurst was a prominent British suffrage activist that was known for her militant tactics. She believed deeds were more powerful than words. When Paul returned to the United States, it led her to argue for a more radical strategy that concentrated on a federal amendment and incorporated nonviolent direct action. She separated herself from the National American Women's Suffrage Association, run by Susan B. Anthony and then Carrie Chapman Catt, and then later developed the National Women's Party to pursue new tactics. The National Women's Party decided that public embarrassment and mockery worked better than begging and negotiating. Paul stated, "Unless women are prepared to fight politically, they must be content to be ignored politically." Paul focused most of her efforts in Washington, D.C. The constant rotation of people and politicians in and out of the city made it the perfect place to manage suffrage work. Lucy Burns, a suffragist, stated, "Her great assets are her power to make plans on a national scale and a supplementary power to see that it is done down to the last postage stamp." Doris Stevens, another prominent suffragist, said in regards to Paul, "I know of no other modern leader with whom to compare her. If she demanded the ultimate of her followers, then she has given it herself." In 1913, Alice Paul and the National Women's Party held a national suffrage parade. It was held on March 3rd and was planned to be on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration and had over 8,000 marchers, 26 floats, 10 bands, 5 squadrons of cavalry, and 6 chariots. Inez Milholland, a well-known suffragist, led the parade, and during the procession she rode on a white horse and wore a long white cape. Photographs from the Library of Congress show her long curly hair flowing, and she wore a simple but elegant crown. Milholland was very beautiful, and her presence in the parade proved to be a powerful statement. She associated the then reigning ideals of beauty, femininity, and womanly virtue with the suffrage cause. Suffrages were often seen as women who would never marry and therefore had nothing better to do than promote suffrage. Milholland during the parade, however, showed that suffragists could be conventionally beautiful and still have a passion for the cause. It also showed suffragists were not a certain type of women. They were composed of all types of women. The suffrage parade of 1913 was a way to guarantee large-scale publicity because holding the parade on the day before the inauguration ensured that large amounts of people and press would already be in the city. The National Women's Party had the opportunity to sell suffrage to the public and show President Woodrow Wilson that suffrage would be a matter he would have to confront. The event was a huge demonstration of power because it proved a large number of suffragists could organize in just one place. Suffragists were a force to be reckoned with, and the parade sent a message to politicians that these women could not be overlooked or underestimated. Another big demonstration by the National Women's Party was the silent Centennials. Alice Paul was a proud pacifist, and when the United States entered World War I, Paul and the National Women's Party were adamantly against it. Suffragists argued it was wrong of the nation to fight for democracy overseas when 50% of the population was not allowed to participate at home. The National Women's Party wanted to publicly hold the government accountable. In 1917, women picketed the White House and carried banners quoting Woodrow Wilson's speeches on democracy. The banners meant to point out the hypocrisy of Wilson's democratic claims. The suffragists were gutsy and held banners asking, "Mr. President, how long must we wait for liberty?" The mockery of his words caused discomfort among the government and the public, forcing more attention to the cause. The Centennials' willingness to resist authority without the use of violence proved adversity and strength. Silence suggested a degree of passive participation and conjured the inspiring legacy of the politically powerless. And an essay in the newspaper, The Suffragist, stated, "Mute but resolute, stepping boldly they are marching on. They can be seen but not heard, and yet they speak millions of tongues. There is the language of the storm, wind, and volcano." The silent Centennials displayed a gendered performance which allowed them to simultaneously invite attention to the movement and establish a militant identity through the bold nature of their actions. Their femininity provided them the means to deploy the militant message. By appropriating the political dimensions of their femininity into their militant identity, it allowed them to close the gap between the ideals of marriage, motherhood, and work. The picketers enjoyed the public gaze and resisted the submissive expectations of women in the 19th century and encapsulated the spirit of the new woman. The National Women's Party accumulated a lot of press coverage during the silent Centennial protests. Weekly coverage from the publications such as the Philadelphia Press, the Chicago Evening Post, the Seattle Post, and the New York Evening Post circulated the news throughout the country. Research suggests the protests and press coverage led Wilson to recognize the suffrage cause with more understanding. In 1918, his speech, "A Moral Partnership Legitimized," showed his embarrassment as he admits all people from his and other nations have been criticizing the United States. Wilson states that creating an amendment for women's suffrage is necessary to uphold the nation's democratic ideals. Although the silent Centennials were empowered and passionate, their dedicated protests did not come without a cost. Bystanders often assaulted the picketers and tore the banners from their hands. Women were also arrested, including leading suffragists and very well-connected women. The press coverage of these arrests was enormous, and Doris Stevens states, "For the first time, our form of agitation began to seem a little more respectable than the administration's handling of it." The protests and publicity emphasized the cost and sacrifices of the silent Centennials. Suffrage activists were frequently arrested. They were placed in district workhouses where they were often tortured. Many women experienced filth and solitary confinement. Imprisoned suffragists were also not allowed to receive mail, access a lawyer, or have visitors. While the women were in prison, they wore a prison uniform commonly referred to as the cloth of guilt. Press coverage of women at the Occoquan prison generated a lot of controversy about the uniforms. The media and public associated the prison uniform with other foul conditions in the workhouse. Forcing the prison dress corrupted the integrity of their bodies and enveloped them in poor hygiene, rotting food, and loose morality of the prison. There was a strong and lasting state of guilt and delinquency in the prison uniform. At the Occoquan workhouse, basic hygiene was ignored. Rats roamed dimly lit cells and maggots were found in meals. On November 14, 1917, resistant women were struck, pushed, and thrown into their cells. The date is referred to as the Night of Terror, and many women suffered broken bones, lacerations, and concussions. Although women faced several injuries, they were denied medical treatment. and as most listeners know, suffragists went on hunger strikes during their time in prison. The hunger strikes led to force feedings, which led to vomiting and dizziness. Many women felt as though they lost their human dignity. In the end, Wilson sent a message to Alice Paul offering to intervene to end the imprisonment if she would give him time to work on a constitutional amendment. In response to the imprisonment and suffering, the National Women's Party created the Prison Express, which consisted of a train tour across the country of the recently freed suffragists. Women wore the prison dress and spoke of the abusive treatment. The train tour was an essential strategy for the National Women's Party because of the visual rhetoric they incorporated. The prison uniform was the necessary visual demonstration of the militant activism of the National Women's Party. The tour pushed the boundaries of good taste to make a powerful statement and a compelling case for suffrage. When performing for the audience, the prison dress startled audiences because it was not expected for these women to be wearing clothes that embodied so much guilt. The uniform was an understood metaphor of bodily oppression. Reports reveal the prison special was well received because audiences were often surprised and disturbed to see that such upstanding and educated women could be clothed in prison gear, much less that they suffered the treatment they endured. Rather than hinting at guilt, the wearing of the prison dress outside the workhouse implied an underlying innocence and unfair persecution. Women were able to reclaim their bodies as political and non-criminal. Although Alice Paul made impressive strides for the right to vote, it doesn't mean that she included everyone in the movement. Alice Paul was often criticized for not fully accepting African American suffragists into the movement. In fact, several white suffragists were criticized for this. Many white suffragists claim that the movement was about a women's issue, which in some sense is true, but it left African American women feeling like they had to ignore their blackness to be a part of the movement. African American suffragists and other suffragists of color felt as though they had a dual burden of race and gender. They were discriminated against because they were black, and they faced different discriminations because they were women. By failing to recognize this intersection of identities, white suffragists were unable to create a movement that encapsulated the needs of all women. Last semester, I was lucky enough to participate in a research project with Professor Katie McIntyre that aimed to find information about African American suffragists in Rhode Island. In 1916, several black women signed a resolution stating they supported the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The women were a part of the RI Union Colored Women's Club, and they signed the document at the Condon Street Baptist Church in Providence, Rhode Island. I would like to take the time to tell you about a few of the women who signed the document. It is important to honor their history and show that black women were active in their community and social justice. They are so often left out of the narrative in many movements, but especially the suffrage movement. We must not forget their strides and the difference they made on the local and national level. One woman who signed the document in 1916 was Jacinthia Perry Brown, who was an active member of the Rhode Island Union of Colored Women's Club. She served as general secretary and later assistant secretary of the organization. She worked closely with the union's president, Mary E. Jackson, to plan suffrage fundraising and social activism events in Providence. Jacinthia, nicknamed J. P. Brown, was born in Virginia in 1891. She most likely moved to Rhode Island as a child. According to the 1910 federal census, 19-year-old Jacinthia was a dressmaker working out of her parents' home at 132 Prospect Street, which was just 1 block away from the Condon Street Baptist Church. She married Edward H. Brown on June 11, 1913, in Providence. According to the New York Age, friends attended the reception for the couple at Rebecca Perry's home on Jenkins Street. Jacinthia and Edward had 5 children and lived on Meeting Street and later then on Pratt Street in Providence with Jacinthia's widowed mother, Rebecca. In 1913, the Providence Journal reported that the Colored Women's Club held its annual meeting on October 13th at the Pond Street Baptist Church. Brown was the general secretary of the club in 1913, and at the conference, club president Mary E. Jackson appointed Jacinthia Brown to work with the Northeastern Federation of Colored Women's Club and their upcoming 1914 Good Friday plan to have all affiliated Colored Women's Club observe a national season of prayer for the needs of colored people. In October 1916, the 13th annual conference of the Rhode Island Union of Colored Women's Club was held at the Conyon Street Baptist Church in Providence. The theme of the Black women's suffrage was discussed again at this meeting, in which Jacinthia was re-elected General Secretary. She became the second signer of the document in 1916 at the Conyon Street Baptist Church. As a young woman of just 25, she already had many years of service in her local community. She passed away on March 12, 1967, at age 76 in Queens, New York. Her funeral service, however, was held at her family's longtime congregation, the Olney Street Baptist Church, and her burial took place at the Locust Elmwood Cemetery in Providence. Cynthia Pease Brown's contributions to women's suffrage also demonstrate her deep commitment to her family and the Baptist faith. Another woman who signed the document in 1916 was Elizabeth, but also known as Lizzie McCoy. She was born in Rhode Island in 1867. Lizzie married a Virginian man, Henry V. McCoy, who was born in 1863. Like many other African Americans from the South at this time, it is highly probable that Henry B. McCoy was the descendant of slaves. Henry worked as a butcher, porter, and chauffeur throughout his life in Rhode Island. Lizzie was mostly a homemaker and occasionally worked as a maid when her children were grown up. She lived with her husband and children in a rented home at 337 North Main Street in Providence. Lizzie and Henry participated in many Providence organizations. Henry was a member of the Douglas Republican Association, named after Frederick Douglass. The organization embraced the Republican Party, the party most likely to support African American causes. The McCoy family also supported the American Protective League. In October 1901, a branch of the League was formed in Providence at the Conyon Street Baptist Church. According to the Providence Journal, the League had about 22 branches in different states and a membership of about 100,000 people. According to the Providence Journal, in 1901, the League was formed to alleviate the conditions of various kinds under which the Negro is at present situated. Henry B. McCoy was president of the Providence American League branch in 1902. Elizabeth McCoy also had a strong faith. She attended many churches over the years, including the Conyon Street Baptist Church, and had several opportunities to participate in services. On Easter 1912, she read the Easter Side paper in church. McCoy also offered readings at meetings of the Westwood Elmwood Lyceum. The meeting was held in the Waldworth Street AME Church. The discussion theme of the evening analyzed Christianity and its bearing upon modern civilization. At age 47, Lizzie McCoy signed the 1916 petition from the Rhode Island Women's Colored Club. At age 47, Lizzie McCoy signed the 1916 petition from the Rhode Island Women's Colored Club and continued to support many other social and political programs. Lizzie McCoy passed away in Providence on November 18, 1938. Her funeral was held at the Bethel African Methodist Lizzie McCoy passed away in Providence on November 18, 1938. Her funeral was held at the Bethel AME Church on Meeting Street in Providence. Overall, the suffrage movement is not as simple as it seems. It took a lot of hard work and dedication for women to get the right to vote. It is also important to recognize that even though white women received the right to vote in 1920, it wasn't for many years later that the law protected all women's right to vote. Hopefully this episode has reminded you that the 19th Amendment was more than the meeting at Seneca Falls, more than Susan B. Anthony, and more than women in white pretty dresses walking in parades. These women sacrificed time and energy and endured scrutiny for what they believed was right. Honor the leaders of the movement, but also remember it took several ordinary women and activists like you and me to propel the movement into what it became. The women of the 20th century provided us with a baseline for future movements and issues that still baffle us today. May these women's legacy be remembered and shed light on our path towards our ultimate goal of freedom and equality for all. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to look out for the next episode on sex, suffrage, and scandalous ladies.